Okay, folks, we'll make a start. So first of all, apologies from our President Carly, who unfortunately is off ill at the moment, so we wish her a speedy recovery. So you've got me instead. But delighted to introduce you to Dr Tara Jonell, who's a postdoctoral researcher in the School of Geographical and Earth Sciences at the University of Glasgow, working on a project called Away from the Water, the First Energy Transition, British Textiles, 1770 to 1890. That's a collaboration between the Universities of Glasgow and Wollongong. And she's going to be telling us about mapping the mills of Britain through the 18th and 19th century Cartographic Revolution. Right, hand over to you.
Thank you so much. Okay, before I get started, yes, this is working, great. All right. Okay, well, thank you so much for this opportunity to tell you a little bit about some of the work that I've been up to with my group. And so, as Matthew kindly mentioned, this is a collaborative effort from several of us, from the University of Glasgow, from the University of Wollongong in Australia, and now Nottingham Trent University. And so this is a collaboration between people like me who are kind of physical geographers, also with geologist backgrounds, as well as social historians and historians of milling and science technology, as well as historical geographers. And so this wouldn't have been possible without their efforts, as well as the wonderful Chris Fleet at the National Library of Scotland, who has been instrumental in creating this resource that I'm going to tell you about in just a moment. And then, of course, some of the pilot work by a PhD student who's finishing here just shortly at the University of Glasgow, E.R. Nave Calton, who's been focusing a lot on the Ordnance Survey maps and how they represent and show the milling industry through time. And so much of what I'm going to be telling to you today is about the mills and the maps and the methods that went into creating this new web resource that is being co-hosted by the National Library of Scotland. And so Chris Fleet was instrumental in helping me build this viewer. And so this viewer showcases all of the mills that are represented on the maps from 18th and 19th century county maps, as well as some of the key military maps for Scotland. And so you might be wondering, why mills, right? So why are we focusing on mills? So mills have been iconic features on British waterways and landscapes for nearly 2 millennia. This way, they've become essentially essential parts of people's everyday lives, where we don't really think about that every day, and how much of what we have and what we do is fundamentally based on these things and their role in the early Industrial Revolution. And so each part of a person's life was inextricably linked to the processes of milling. So the clothes that they wore, the boots that they wore, the flour that they ground from corn, as well as the spinning and the weaving for those textiles, for those clothing. So one of my favorite kind of paraphrased quotes that I use to describe mills is that outside of wartime, mills were the most powerful, elaborate, and costly machines used by people. And so that is the central role that we're going to be looking at. And so by understanding the number and the distribution of mills in the past through time, so again, looking at how they're spread across the landscape and the types and the functions and the power that those mills used, we can essentially connect these fundamental relationships between people, their industry, the economics of those regions and those nations, the type of technologies that they were applying, as well as how those populations grew and fed themselves. In particular, myself, since I'm more of a physical geographer and a geologist, I'm really curious in how people were using the natural resources and landscapes around them. So how are they using water mills, for example? But today we're really going to focus on the people who made those maps and the maps themselves, and what they can tell us and what they do not tell us about mills. And so I'm going to mention a little bit today that mills are kind of like snapshots in time. Although this is a bit kind of idealistic, as I will point out near the end of the presentation, we're going to use these as kind of windows in time to, again, look at how mills were distributed and their numbers throughout essentially mainland Britain in the 18th and the 19th century. So we're going to be using the 18th and 19th century county maps in a key military survey done for Scotland to view this cartographic revolution that was taking essentially Europe and then Britain by storm. And this is when maps became more than just evocative drawings, just really schematics of the world around them, where people were looking for empirical truths in the science and the nature and the processes around them. And by doing that, they were able to more accurately measure and mark the orientation, size, and shapes of objects in their real world. And then we end up getting into what we think of as the most systematic and standardized maps that began to exist for most of mainland Britain, the Ordnance Survey maps of the middle and late 19th century. So today we're going to travel again from the late 17th century, where again things look more of a schematic, more of an illustration, more of a drawing, to something that looks like what we would call a map. And so key to these 18th and 19th century maps that are essentially these county maps that I'm going to be talking about is that they have near national coverage. This is the first time, especially across mainland Britain, especially when we talk about lowland Scotland, Wales, and England, that you have almost all coverage for all of the counties at a particular point in time, if not two surveys that exist at that time. Additionally, this is when we started getting scientific triangulation. And this again is going to give us a much better orientation, size, and shape to the objects that we're looking at in the real world. So rivers look like rivers, roads look like roads, and not only that, they're going to start codifying information within these maps. So we're going to have patterns, and we're going to have symbols that are specifically tied to key features, such as moorland and common land and wasteland, and specifically in our case, mills. And so we're going to use this information, of course, to record those mills. Additionally, this is when we get medium high resolution coverage, and by that I mean maps are beginning to be at the 1 inch to the mile or greater scale, so 1, 2, 3, 4 inches to the mile. Before that, there wasn't really a determined scale. Additionally, this is also when you start having maps that weren't just copied from prior maps. They were done using completely new surveys, and before these maps were published, they were externally ratified and reviewed by local experts. So again, this is the technical, this cartographic revolution that's happening that we're going to utilize to document mills. So we can go back to the beginning where this really kind of started. So we can more or less blame or thank France for this. And so at the end of the 17th century, I believe in this like 1660s, the king said to the French Academy of Sciences that he desired the most accurate map of France ever created. And so this is what they set out to do by commissioning these maps to the Cassini-Turri family. Unfortunately for the Cassini-Turri family, it took them over 133 years to actually finish this survey, from essentially the initial, essentially pilot survey that they did, and then showed to the king to say it was all good, all right, and then it took them until 1815 to finish the last map sheet. And so the first 20 years of their survey, they did kind of this initial triangulation, and they showed it to the king. King Louis XIV was quite offended at what they showed him. They showed him that France was actually a fifth smaller than they thought it was. Instead of being 150,000 square kilometers, it was 120,000 square kilometers, and led to this famous outburst by the king. "You have cost me more territory than all of my enemies." Okay, so we're going to talk about how many of the surveyors woefully underestimated the financial and the physical burden of these surveys. This includes the Cassini family, where they had many breaks and funding cuts, and they even had military intervention. Because when they finished most of their surveys, it was 1790. So again, the historians in the audience might go, uh-oh. 1792, the French Revolution broke out, and they essentially seized those maps. They could not be sold. It took until Napoleon Bonaparte came into power in 1804 that he let them continue their survey and get to the last map sheet by 1815. However, drips and drabs of these maps came out, and other people within Europe as well as in Britain began to realize that they needed to catch up to France. And so it was in many different places that Britain began to realize that they were woefully underprepared and woefully, they're inadequate in terms of their mapping, excuse me. And so this is also the time of European Enlightenment, where again, they're wanting to better understand science and nature, and that includes knowing the real world around them. However, you also have a lot of military conflict at this time, and so they're asserting their power over an area by mapping it as well. You also have a burgeoning population across most parts of mainland Britain at this time, so you have to feed them. And so in terms of agricultural improvement and the acts of enclosure as well as annexation of various estates to improve them, you're going to need to have maps and plans. Additionally, you're going to have to schlep all of that food and all of those resources for enclosure and heating people's homes around the nation at that time. So of course you're going to need more maps and plans. So this is where some of these original incentives started. But we could really point the finger at one particular individual, especially in terms of the county maps for England, and that's William Borlase, when he was whinging to his friend in a letter. And so it happened that his friend Henry Baker was a secretary for the Society of the Arts, which was a very large organization of benefactors for arts, trade, and manufacture. So this is what he wrote to his friend. And he said, "Our maps of England and its counties are extremely defective. If among your premiums for drawing, so the prizes, some reward were offered for the best planned measurement and actual survey," and by that he means new survey, "of a city or district, it might move the attention of the public towards geography, and in time perhaps incline the administration," and by that he means the government, "to take this matter into their hands," and by that he means funding this, "and employ proper persons every year from actual surveys to make accurate maps of the districts," blah, 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 blah. Okay. Little did he know that it would take 50 years after this point to even get the first maps really out for almost every single county. And it would take nearly 80 years for the government to step in to fund any of this. Most of this was privately funded. Okay. So this is where we start with some of these mapping proposals, these new surveys. So I know the text is really tiny for those of some of you in the back, but in general, the Society of Arts began to offer a series of premiums or awards for these best surveys, and it became quite lucrative. And so they suggested that if you conducted a new survey, it needed to be conducted again at that 1 inch to the mile scale. It needed to have coordinates, so by that I mean it had to have latitude and longitude. So longitude was quite difficult to get at the time, so that was quite something. And then of course accurate coastlines, because again we're dealing with the 18th and 19th century when the roads weren't so great, but it was much faster to go by ship. They did not specify a duration of the survey, so that means you could take basically as long as you wanted, which happened to be a problem. And lastly, you generally had to be a notable amateur or a gentleman in order to conduct these, and you had to usually have some sort of connection with your printer or engraver to get this done. And then lastly, you had to be okay with having this externally reviewed by experts, and by this it was usually landed gentry or other local landowners. Okay. So these surveys were slow, muddy, meticulous, and extremely expensive work. As essentially a master surveyor, you would employ a team of apprentice surveyors with you, various local laborers, and a whole pack of draft horses to essentially haul your stuff around. You would be out in the field for months, if not years, to conduct these surveys. Because again, you're moving by foot or you're going essentially by horse. There really weren't very good roads for most of this, and you were carrying lots of heavy equipment that had to be taken care of because it was, again, had to be scientifically accurate. And so these people would need to triangulate, and by this they would need to very precisely find the compass bearing and then measure using a series of rods and chains from one object to the next. And so this is just an example of one of these triangulations, such as to a church steeple, a town hall, a really big tree, let's say, in the middle of a field, or, and luckily in my case, a windmill. So they would use these features to create this triangular net, which would give you your proportions and the relative orientations on your map. And so this is one of the things that make these maps quite unique. It gives you that realistic map-like look. And so in eastern Scotland especially, there was a really good surveying school, and they actually had a burgeoning field of land surveyors. And this just graph shows you that it says like professional man years, but really it's like men who are surveyors. And then this is time on the x-axis. And so here into the beginning of the around 1800, you see a spike of surveyors with the first county surveys, a bit of a lull when there was kind of some agricultural depression and economic depression, and then you had another giant series of surveys done around the 1810s and 1820s, and then in this case, this is when the Ordnance Survey and central government funding came in, and the surveying trade died off. But in general, we have two good series of surveys, and Scotland produced a lot of very good land surveyors. But as I mentioned, surveys were hard work. They were expensive and physically burdensome. And so compared to the cost of the actual survey, so again, you're having to support this team in the field for months, if not a few years at a time, the prize offered by the Society for the Arts was minuscule. So compared to their prizes, which started at £100 and eventually became about £50 near the end of the scheme, it wasn't enough to fund even a single county survey. So some of these surveys costed upwards of about £2,400, which was a lot of money at that time. And so they had to rely on this private enterprise. So you're the subscribers of the maps, and usually these people would do it on good faith, So they would pay half up front and then half essentially when you produce the map. But sometimes to make ends meet, they ended up putting a lot of their own money into the scheme itself. But this became extremely problematic for many, if not most, of these map makers and county surveyors. So it led to debt, various court and litigation problems, bankruptcy for many of these individuals. Even to one of the individuals called geographer to the king, Thomas Jeffreys, who produced probably some of the most accurate and beautiful maps, in my opinion, he became bankrupt, and he left his family with only £20 to their name when he died. You had people going to the workhouses and to prisons. You had people even probably embezzling some of that money that their subscribers gave to them. So Peter Burdett is a very interesting individual. And he embezzled all this money and fled to Saxony and just left his family to the creditors. Or you could have even worse essentially happen to you, where some people even took their own lives. So it was really difficult, but they ended up producing, again, some of these remarkable maps that we have for the period. So the other group that we're going to briefly look into that was producing maps for this period was, of course, the military. So many of us are acutely aware that after the Jacobite Rebellion, most of the Hanoverian commanders were let's say, greatly embarrassed for want of a proper survey of the country. They wanted to put a bunch of roads, essentially through the highlands, and they needed to get maps for the enclosure and the annexation of various estates, so they needed to map it properly. And to do this, they got assistant quartermaster William Roy, who was a Lanarkshire man, and they more or less hired him and a pack of surveyors that he was able to pick out and have as apprentices to map the highlands and the lowlands. And so he was able to do this essentially immediately after the Battle of Culloden and until about 1755, where then he was called very quickly down to the southern coast in Kent and Dorset because they were really worried about some sort of French invasion at the time that never actually happened. But in this case, he produced what we think is a landmark piece of cartography, where he very humbly states that it's rather a magnificent military sketch than really a map. But I would beg to differ, as many people would. It is an incredible piece of work, and it outshines almost anything that was made for nearly 80 years for much of Scotland in terms of surveying. And what's more is that the training that Roy gave to his apprentices, many of those people went on to be absolutely foundational to the Ordnance Survey, which is why we call him the father of the Ordnance Survey. Okay, so now we've talked a little bit about the incentives and the humans, again, who made these maps, that they have all the reasons for why they were making their maps. And so we have to always keep that in mind when we're looking at these, again, these types of media. Right? So maps are not actual snapshots of reality, as much as we want to believe. And so how did we actually go about recording these mills for maps? And so this is kind of the second half, if you will, of the presentation. So mills on county maps were most often identified using a combination of symbols. So I'll use the term symbol, icon, and pictograph probably interchangeably. And then they can sometimes be annotated with text or just standalone text, just saying mill, for example. Or they will also have a really key position to the waterway. And I'll talk to you a little bit about why this is really important for water mills, for example. Additionally, with this information, it will sometimes tell you a little bit about the power that is being used at the mill. So like water mill, for example, or horse gin for horse engine, so like an animal mill, or a steam mill, for example. Additionally, the purpose of the mill or the function of the mill can sometimes be indicated in the text as well. So like silk mill, corn mill, walking mill, for example. However, in our case, looking at the nearly 20,000 observations that we have for mills that we've gathered from these maps, that 80% of those mills that we have are represented by symbol. And I'll go through some of the symbols in just a moment. And about 36% of those then include information about text. And again, that's about its function or maybe its name, for example. And then about 6% of that, again, is about the function. So we have actually very little information about what these mills were doing exactly from maps, which is kind of unfortunate, but it just means we'll have to use other cool archival resources. So in terms of watermill representation, the most common symbol that was used looks like a circle or an asterisk with little sticky outy bits, and that represents the vanes or the paddles on a water wheel. And so your water wheel symbol is going to represent a water mill. So for example, we have some of the really simple ones located right here. You can have a little bit more of an elaborate version right here, which is one done by Thomas Jeffries, which shows a building with an externally mounted water wheel. You can have, again, an asterisk or that water wheel symbol with some text telling you indeed it is a mill. You can have something a little bit more ambiguous, which is just a set of buildings with Russell's Mill, for example, here over in Fifeshire, done by William Roy. Or on some maps, you don't have any information really that is typical, like you don't have a water wheel symbol, you just have a plan of a building with some annotations on it. And so this is another map by Thomas Jeffries, who tells you that it is actually a water mill because he uses the term Kellam wheel. And you can see, additionally, that there's a mill laid and a tail race also depicted on this map. So you have water being taken in through a building where there's an internal water wheel and then out back again to the river. And similarly with this silk mill, you have a mill laid bringing it into the building where there's probably a water wheel and then back out again. And so we can use this information also about the external infrastructure about water mills to understand more about what types of mill it was. So here's just an absolute array of different types of symbology and information that we have about water mills, and also textile mills, of course, on some of these county maps, as well as the military maps, which are at the top. And so we can also see larger mill dams. So we have paper mill dam, for example. We even have mill ponds that are shown here in Cheshire, in this county map for Cheshire, where each mill has its own individual mill pond and water wheel symbol. It's a little bit hard to make out, but maybe the eagle-eyed among you can see the individual little water wheel symbols with tiny little mill ponds. Additionally, we have long and short mill lathes, sometimes which you can tell in this William Roy military map, that the mill of Balbirnie at the top is using a secondary river channel as its mill lathe, where the mill of Kinnaird down in kind of in the bottom of it is instead using a man-made lathe, because it's really thin and very tiny, not following kind of a natural course of a river. You can see all different types of water lathes or mills shown without water lathes throughout all these different maps. And so, since the project that I was working on is focused primarily on textiles, of course, we were really keen to find information about water-powered textile mills. And so here are just some of the examples of a walk or a walking mill. So that's where you're going to full wool and cloth to kind of tighten up the weave and soften that wool. Additionally, you have Crossley Cotton Mill with a beautifully long lathe, which is a great walk, by the way, if you have a free weekend, to go to Renfrewshire and check that out. And then, of course, down here, which you might be able to see, is a lint mill. And so that's just a linen mill, for example. So similarly, with watermill representation, there's a variety of windmill representation. But rarely was the actual form of the mill truly representative of the actual form of the windmill. We do have some rare cases for this, though, and I'll walk you through this for a moment. So the most common type of windmill at the time in the 18th century were post mills. And so this is an example of an open trestle post mill. And so you have basically this body of a mill with a kind of this little, I forget what this is called at the moment, sorry. But more or less you can rotate the entire body of the mill to better face essentially the seasonal winds or changing wind patterns of the area. And to keep the mill sturdy, you have a foundational post that is more or less sunken into the ground or a mound. And then you kind of have this trestle structure beneath it, so like these three legs that more or less help support the body of that mill. Okay, so now if we look at the symbology of some of the some of the windmills, excuse me. Well, some of the military map, which here I'll use here we go, this might be a little better, here we go. So some of these military map names is usually quite ambiguous, where we have just windmill in text, windmill with a very generic looking windmill icon, and similarly over here with the mill of Drumburnie. But in some of the later county maps, we see this iconic post mill, this open trestle post mill figure, and even here's one with one of its mill mounds. So as we get into the 19th century, we ended up having tower mills. And so tower mills, instead of having a completely rotating body, they more or less have a rotating cap on the top that can move around independently. And the tower mill itself is going to be built of stone, and this allows it to be more resilient, stronger, and taller. And so most county maps do not show us anything really about tower mills, unfortunately. Part of it's the timing, but I think simply it's just the choice of representation by many of these surveyors. However, in one map that I've been able to find, if not two, we actually do have representation of different types of windmills on these maps. So for example, here we have our open trestle post mill shown here as an old mill. And then additionally, we have this tower mill that's indicated even as a new mill. But by far and large, this was very rarely the case. Okay. So now that we know what to look for in terms of the symbols for those mills, how did we actually go about doing that anyway? So over the last 20 years, rapid improvement in digital technologies have rapidly expanded access to the digital materials that have been put out by various libraries and societies. And by that I mean the scanning and the digitization of maps. And so that allows people like me to very easily hunt these things. And so this was quite important because the initial part of this project was done during COVID, when there was very limited access to pretty much anything, but especially archives. So having these digitally was quite good. But I have actually gone to the British Library as well as the National Library of Scotland to look at more rare and fragile map editions in person. And so what we were able to do is we were able to consult over 140 of these maps that had specific milling information, where we looked at many, many more, but only about 140 of them had very good mill information on them. And then I went through and manually counted all of these mills. So I highly recommend doing that. It's very relaxing with an audiobook. I stand by it. And so I was able to come up with about 23,000 of these mill records just from these county maps. And so what was also quite important, because our project was working on the industrial period, so we wanted to get a really good idea of what early industrial period was like, as well as kind of the middle, quote-unquote, industrial period. So what's also working for us is that we have multiple county map surveys. So we took essentially a snapshot, if you will, from these maps around 1770, give or take a decade or so, and then again for the 1820s, and then give or take a decade or so depending on the county. And so based on the various maps that we have, they also are quite variable in their quality and detail, which we'll see when we put all this data together in just a few minutes. So did anybody count these while I was talking? So there's 11 of these on there. So yeah, okay. And so in a similar way, we utilized the Roy Military Survey maps. And so in 2022, the National Library of Scotland, with a bunch of volunteers, put together the Roy Gazetteer. And this is where they tagged over 20,000 Gaelic and English words on those maps. And so thank you to them. And so we were able to then query that entire database for milling information. And by that, I mean different phonetic variations for both the Gaelic and the English terms. So we're going to use words like mill, or miln, or voulin, for example, and all the variations of how you could even possibly spell those. But it's also important that we filter out all the extraneous other stuff, where there are many words that have mill in it, but they are not actually mills themselves. Or geographic features like Mill Burn or Mill Craig, for example, we're not actually interested in those things. They're probably located adjacent to a mill, but they are not a mill itself. So we had to go through and remove all that other information. But more or less, we're able to tag all of those mills, and then I went in and then double-checked everything and looked for various symbols and pictographs as well. So you might also be wondering that there's a certain amount of ambiguity or uncertainty in some of these things. You might have noticed that some of these mills, for example, just say mill. And they might not clearly be a water mill or an animal mill or a steam mill, for example. So how do we go about assigning them a possibility? So how many of these mills were water mills? And so what we ended up doing is we can use the position of those mills to get a pretty good idea of if they are a water mill or not. Because water mills are fundamentally tied to waterways, such that they have to take a portion of that water from the river, use it, and then put it back. So if we use all of those data points that we collected, so all of those symbols, what can we say? So we took all the water wheel symbols, all the windmill symbols, things that were windmills that were draining things, so pumping water, and then all of the unspecified or ambiguous symbols, and measured their distance relative to waterways. And so already, so this is distance to waterway, and then this is just the number of records for each one. So you can ignore the y, this is the distance. So you're close to a waterway over here, you're far away from the water over here. So windmills can be anywhere. Drain mills are kind of close to water. And of course, water wheels are really close to water, where clearly marked water mills with water wheel symbols are probably less than about 150 meters from a waterway. And so you already might be noticing that the uncertain or ambiguous mill symbols are also really, really close to water. And so even though they could be any type of mill, it's more likely that they're probably a water mill. And so this is really interesting, because this would suggest that the term mill used by surveyors in the past meant water mill. That just innately the function of a mill, in and of itself, the nature of that mill was to be powered by water. And so it just makes us think about the terminology of the time and how people thought about mills. And so when we think about this a little bit, it's like, let's pretend we're surveyors for a moment. So if we're going out and we're trying to identify a mill, how do we tell what it is? So with a windmill, it's kind of easy. You just look out on a landscape. So here is a beautiful engraving sketch done of Leicestershire. And you can see in the foreground, there's a whole bunch of windmills. On the hills, you can see there are a few windmills. And in the countryside, you can see there are a few windmills. So there's no mistaking that these mills are indeed windmills. So you can tell from a far distance what type of mill they are and what power they're using. And so in many cases, this was the same for water mills. Because all that external infrastructure, so the mill lathes, the tail races, and those externally mounted wheels on the outside of the mill, you would have to be pretty blind not to see that. So many of the water mills were probably easily identified by surveyors as well. Maybe not as easily or as far away as those windmills, but certainly across from a river. Okay, so let's take kind of all of this information together and look at the growth of our mills through time. So I'm going to run through this animation a few times, and we're just going to see as the different county map surveys pop up, where mills also start to pop up. And so again, we'll do this a few times. And so you might begin to notice that already there are some areas that are not well represented, that they're just giant gaps, almost whole counties missing. You also might notice that there are very rapid changes in the numbers of mills in particular counties in just an instant as well. Or in particular counties, for example, if you're familiar with, you also might notice, well, I know there's got to be more mills than that. And so as we go through time, you'll notice that there were some counties that were surveyed far earlier than others. There were also some counties that were surveyed far later than others, or some counties that weren't surveyed at all. Additionally, there were some surveyors who, let's just say, weren't maybe that great at surveying, where they were more worried about the production of lots of maps at a time rather than the quality of the map at the time. And so we have to remember this human element of looking at these mills all the time. So again, we can have a pretty good idea of where mills are distributed, but again, we have to keep that in mind. And so this is going to bring home that, again, maps are interpretations and not reality. That this can be said of any map that we look at, that all maps are just our observations, but they're inclusive of error and subject to bias. By that I mean it's going to have all these different little human things within them. They're going to cause them to, again, be interpretations, where these county maps are definitely much more accurate than the ones that existed before them. But it doesn't mean that they don't have flaws. And so I mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation that the time and the condition and the duration of these surveys, they were financially and physically very burdensome for people to do. Additionally, you had to rely on these surveyors to identify those maps, as well as actually represent them in their field notes. And then they had to take those field notes and make a nice fair copy to then hand over to the engraver. And then that engraver would then probably engrave a copper plate that then would be printed. And maybe that printing wasn't so great, or maybe they forgot something, or maybe they had too many of something. But once you have a copper engraving, you can't take anything off. Additionally, you have these maps, right? They're made on various different types of parchment and eventually paper materials. And so they're going to become fragile, and they're going to darken over time, and they're going to fade over time. So the quality of their preservation, their curation, is going to affect on how we, later researchers, are going to be able to access that information. Additionally, you have, of course, people like me who are also doing their own type of surveying, but it's a little bit different. So there's also going to be some error, even that I'm going to put into, of course, all of this interpretation, because we're all human. And so, hopefully, I might wrap up here in just a moment. So I'll flip over some of these slides here, but that's all on the website. Just to get to, after all of this, after I've kind of presented all of this information about maps and mills and then said, don't trust it, what are some of these reliable numbers that we could actually get at when we think about mills across Britain, as told by maps? So that's a very important quality, is that these are just a starting point for further research. And so, by 1800, it is commonly suggested across literature and the public eye that there were about 10 to 20,000 watermills. And most of the time, you'll see the higher estimate quoted most of the time. And so we know that early maps probably give us a reliable minimum based on everything that we know. And so using those kind of first, second, and we're working on a third snapshot now for Ordnance Survey maps, that we can get at, there are probably 7.5, or maybe just over 8, to maybe a little over 11,000 watermills by these key periods. But again, since we know based on the animation that there are counties that are not represented well, or very accurately, or not at all, we're going to add a little bit of plus or minus 10 or 15% to that. And so if we do that, we can get this generic number of about 10,500 watermills in existence in mainland Britain around 1800. This is a pretty good number. So if we even were to inflate this a little bit, or think of, okay, well, based on all of the records that we have over the entire time, and we think that they're all active, all at the same time, how many mill sites would there be? Well, if we do that, we only get about 15,500. So whichever number kind of sits well with you, you can take that. But I would say this one is probably the most accurate one that we have for now for watermills from maps. And so this just kind of helps conclude some of the information that I've shown you today, that we're working on using maps to showcase how many mills and the distribution of those mills through time. We focused on kind of this intermediary period of the 18th and 19th century maps, but we are trying to kind of bridge that into the Ordnance Survey period, as well as bring in post-medieval evidence all the way from Doomsday. So hopefully I can report back at another time with more milling information, but for today I'm just going to conclude a little bit. So early maps, and of course all maps, have flaws, but we can use them in really interesting and novel ways. And so these 18th and 19th century maps mark a technical revolution in British map making, where this is when they were having new surveys done more accurately ever than before, using the best types of measurement and precision at the time. So in many cases, these county maps are actually comparable to some of the earliest Ordnance Survey maps that come out, so the old series maps. I didn't get a chance to talk about that today, but again, it's on the NLS web resource that I'll share here in just a moment. And so all of what I've talked about today, all of the mill data is open, public, and accessible. And so hopefully this will create a very versatile and informative and powerful way for people to kind of look at history in a slightly different way. And so all of this scanning and digitization that societies and archives are doing is helping more or less create whole new data sets to, again, use old sources in new ways. And so with that, I'd just like to thank you so much for this opportunity and your attention, and I'll open up for questions.